Good morning, History 259. It's Wednesday, April the 8th. I hope you're all well. I've heard from almost all of you, and it sounds like everybody's doing well, but I hope you continue to do well. And so this is week 11's video lecture. Before I get into the subject for today, which is the Articles of Confederation and the so-called critical period, just a couple of reminders. First of all, you should have the assignment sheet for the second primary source paper. That is something I emailed to you last week, and it's also posted on Blackboard under the Information tab. So if you haven't looked at that, definitely do so. The paper's due on Blackboard on Friday, the 10th, and you have until the end of the day, 11:59 p.m. to turn that in, so make sure you do that. Please email me if you have any questions about that. Although, as I mentioned last week, video lecture, it's the exact same assignment. So keep an eye out for that. Make sure to get that completed. Just looking forward in the syllabus before diving into today's topic, a couple of points I want to make. First of all, there is a obviously video lecture today. I'm not going to ask you to do a discussion board post, largely because you are working on your paper now. I do want you to watch this video, of course, though, to set up the discussions that we'll have for the last 4 weeks of class, which is to say the period of American history called the Early Republic. So today we're going to discuss the decade of the 1780s. And then next week and the several weeks after, we'll get into the 1790s up until the year 1800, which is the formal endpoint for our class. One thing I want to just point you to before getting into today's topic is that, and you can see this on the amended syllabus, next week, next Monday, the 13th, I'm going to post on Blackboard the prompt for the final course essay, which you will need to complete and post to Blackboard by May the 20th. So you'll have it 5 weeks in advance. And as a slight difference from the original syllabus, which obviously so much has changed in the last several weeks, I'm going to just give you a prompt, and it'll be sort of broadly written, and it'll be applicable to the entire time period which we've discussed in this class, which is formally 1763 to the year 1800, that will ask you to think about this broad sweep of time in a general way, but to provide specific examples. In the general theme, which you'll read next week when you get the prompt, is a fairly straightforward question that I think is actually quite complex, and it's a theme that we've been building up in various ways since the beginning of the semester, which is how revolutionary was the American Revolution, the War for Independence. So look for that next Monday, and again, you'll have 5 weeks to complete it. Otherwise, I think that's all of the sort of administrative updates that I have. So what I want to do now then is to transition into discussion of today's theme, which again is the Articles of Confederation, but more importantly, the critical period. The critical period is a period of time that's roughly 1783 until 1789, which corresponds to the immediate period after the formal end of the American Revolution, which, as you know from reading Alan Taylor's book, American Revolutions, the American Revolution formally ended in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, a treaty which, again, provided a formal negotiation between the United States, newly independent, and the British Empire. And that treaty had, I think it's fair to say, ultimately in the long run, world-changing effects. But what I want to talk about today in this so-called critical period is corresponding to Chapter 9 of American Revolutions, the reading for this week, which is pages 313 to 351. So I want to build on some of the themes that Alan Taylor begins. And first I'm going to start with discussing what the critical period means, because the critical period is a term that is used traditionally by historians to talk about the 1780s, the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution and the War for Independence, but one which isn't really discussed directly by Alan Taylor. Briefly and simply, the critical period means that in the immediate years after the end of the War for Independence, the United States, for a variety of reasons, which we will get into and build upon Alan Taylor's discussion, was an infant nation, a newly born nation, which was remarkably unstable, and which was also, according to people within the United States and to observers from outside the United States, in Europe, for example, a nation which seemed to be destined to fail. And so the 1780s is a critical period because you could think of it as the United States being critically weak from the moment of its founding. And to return to a theme that we've been discussing since the very beginning of the semester, this basic idea that the 1780s was widely viewed as, or this immediate post-revolution period was widely viewed as a time in which the United States would fail, pushes back on more traditional narratives of the War for Independence, creating a nation, the United States, which was destined to become powerful. We know that that did happen, but that was not an expectation that was held by many people in the so-called critical period. So why was this period critical? For three basic reasons. First, conflicts within the North American continent suggested to many people, many observers in North America and outside North America, that a nation founded on the principles of a republic, which we've discussed before, so I'm not going to go into that in too much detail now, but that a nation that was founded on the principles of a republic on a broad geographical scale would fail. Most observers believed so because they believed that a republic, a system of a representative, somewhat democratic system, would only work in small geographical spaces, that the young United States was too large, and as a secondary point, had too many different what were called competing interests or interest groups, social classes, white, black, Native American, that would lead to the nation becoming politically and socially undermined from the very beginning. Secondarily, and we'll get into this when we talk more in a little bit about the Articles of Confederation, the early United States faced a critical period in the 1780s because of financial reasons. Very hard, pragmatic, economic reasons suggested to many people that the United States is going to fail. And I'll talk more about this shortly, but the decade of the 1780s, the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution, coincided with an economic depression throughout North America that suggested to many that the United States would fail. The third reason why the United States faced a so-called critical period was because of the failure of the first American governmental structure, which was called the Articles of Confederation. This Articles of Confederation government had significant weaknesses, which I'll go into more detail in a second, that suggested, suggested to many people that what it would in fact happen is that the first American government would fail, and that possibly portions of regional portions, I should say, of the young United States would break away from the country and either themselves become independent or perhaps would join other European empires. And ironically, there was a fear that the region of New England would in fact join or rejoin the British Empire. A deep irony given the fact that, as we know, Massachusetts was the largest New England state, was at the vanguard of protest to the British Empire. So these three reasons, internal divisions, financial difficulties, and governmental difficulties under the Articles of Confederation, combined to make this period a critical period. So I want to begin with talking about the first reason, the so-called internal divisions. And here we can begin with Alan Taylor's chapter 9, called Shocks, much of which is concerned with reason number 1, internal divisions. And I want to just start with a quotation, and this is from page 315, because I think it really directly expresses the internal divisions and the extent to which these internal divisions threaten to break apart the early United States. And so I'm reading from page 315 here, quote, "During the 1780s, the end of the war for independence, created new complications and many geopolitical possibilities. The peace treaty, the Treaty of Paris, set in motion an array of peoples with competing visions for the continent. Who were these people? Enslaved and formerly enslaved people of African descent, white loyalists, people who fought against the American Revolution or opposed the American Revolution, and Native Americans. And in general, these are the 3 groups of people that are the main focus of Alan Taylor's chapter, which is called Shocks, and that the name of that chapter is very suggestive, right? That a series of shocks, in this case, internal conflicts, threatened again the project of nation building in the early United States. So I want to start with slavery, just as Alan Taylor does. And this connects back to the discussion that we had last week. Coffee, by the way. Which was about the issue of slavery and nationhood. And as I said last week, and as Alan Taylor begins this chapter, one of the most ironic facts about the American Revolution, again, which was a revolution fought on rhetorical principles of liberty, equality, and natural rights, was that, in fact, the British Empire was the primary emancipatory force during the American Revolution. And as I said last week, and as Alan Taylor also discusses in this chapter, about 30,000 slaves gained their freedom as a result of supporting the British Empire's effort to suppress, to put down the American Revolution. And Alan Taylor begins this chapter with the years 1782 and 1783, discussing the demobilization, the withdrawal of both the British Army, but also people freed by the British Army as a result of the American Revolution. So this is the first shock that Alan Taylor discusses, right? That one of the array of peoples with competing visions for the continent was in fact newly freed, newly emancipated people of African descent. And he gives us some really telling statistics, for example, on 313 and 314, that when the British Army evacuated from Charleston, South Carolina, its main point of access to the South during the war, 2,000 troops, 3,100 loyalists, and 3,500 slaves evacuated with it. 5 months later, as he says, the British removed 4,000 troops, 4,200 loyalists, and 1,500 freed African Americans, and 7,000 enslaved African Americans owned by loyalists. So there's already a massive movement of people from the very end of the war, the very beginning of the post-war period. What we're seeing are massive migrations and forced migrations of people that are one element of the shock of the end of the American Revolution. As Alan Taylor continues to discuss, and as I want to emphasize here, the internal conflicts that existed before the American Revolution, during the American Revolution, continued after the American Revolution ended. So it wasn't just that there were, as there were during the war, loyalists and patriots, right? People who remained loyal to the British Empire, and people who, patriots, who of course fought for American independence. It was that within these groups, loyalists and patriots, there were also internal divisions. And this is something that Alan Taylor certainly discusses, right? That, for example, when we shift our gaze to the northern regions of North America, we see that when loyalists demobilized, were removed from the young United States. We have white loyalists and black loyalists, people of African descent and African Americans, who themselves were not a monolithic group of people and who had very different experiences in the post-war period. As Alan Taylor writes in pages in particular, pages 320 to 323, we find that the experience of newly freed people of African descent was, to put it mildly, not positive. Many of them were moved to Canada, which was, on the one hand, you could think of it as a positive migration in that people who were freed, specifically those who had been enslaved to Patriot masters, while they were not re-enslaved, they did not find the opportunities that they had hoped to find by being relocated by the British Empire, in particular to Nova Scotia, which is in Canada. And we find racial discrimination, we find economic hardship amongst those people. And as Alan Taylor writes in 322 and 323, eventually many of those people were resettled in a colony called Sierra Leone, which is now a nation on the northwestern coast of Africa. So while it's positive in that almost 30,000 enslaved people did gain their freedom as a result of supporting the British Empire, it would be a mistake for us to think that their lives were unmitigated success afterward. When we look at white loyalists, and here I'm beginning on page 323 with a section called refugees, what we find is that white loyalists experience a significant amount of financial hardship and experienced, moreover, quite shocking violence at the hands of former patriots. And that is a theme that we talked about 2 weeks ago, the first video lecture when we discussed the problem of loyalism during the American Revolution. And Alan Taylor makes very clear that the experiences of white loyalists in North America after the American Revolution and white loyalists who were resettled outside North America were not necessarily positive or unmitigated successes. And that's something to just remember in a context of thinking about the meaning of the American Revolution, is that while the American Revolution was successful for the American revolutionaries and their French and Spanish allies, it would be a mistake for us to think that to sort of blindly celebrate it as a movement in favor of freedom. All we need to do is to look at the experiences of white and black loyalists, white loyalists, and people of African descent who gained their freedom, to see that, right? That the violence and hardship that certainly existed during the war continued to exist for these groups of people after the war. Now, when we look at the second reason for calling the United States a critical period, we want to focus on the experience of Native Americans, the vast majority of whom, even though they were loyal to the British Empire, were not, I should say, resettled outside of North America. And here I would point your attention to pages 334 and 335 of the chapter, and just looking at page 335, which is a map of the United States, in North America in the year 1783, the first official year of American independence. One of the things that we see is, first of all, the geographical extent of the early United States, which extended west to the Mississippi River, to the left on the map, and south to what at the time was Spanish territory. If you look at the bottom of that map, Spanish Florida, and then farther to the west, New Orleans, and north to a boundary that more or less corresponded to the Great Lakes, which you can see at the top of the map. But most importantly, when we're thinking about this in the context of Native Americans and internal conflicts, we have loyalists who leave, we have loyalists who remain. And Native Americans, as we've discussed in a couple of different contexts earlier in the semester, were very wary, very suspicious of an independent United States, because they knew that North American colonists and by 1783, United States citizens, those who were in support of the American independence movement, deeply desired access to Western lands. So if we look at the map on page 335, we can draw a big circle around about the center of the map. If you look to the west of the Appalachian Mountains, in the Ohio River Valley, which encompasses cities that are now Pittsburgh, Detroit, Sandusky, Ohio, etc., that gigantic region called the Ohio River Valley, to the north of the Ohio River, which you can see on the map, was a region that white American citizens after 1783 were, excuse my language, hell-bent on settling and therefore displacing Native Americans from. So according to Alan Taylor, and this is certainly correct, one of the most important aspects of the immediate post-revolutionary period is that the presence of Native Americans and their willingness to resist white American expansion into the West was a major internal conflict, meaning internal to the North American continent, that threatened to destabilize the United States. Native Americans, as Alan Taylor makes very clear, were in a very difficult position in the years after 1783. As he says on page 334, quote, "Natives felt betrayed by their British allies." Why? Because the British Empire, through the Treaty of Paris, ceded Western territory west of the Mississippi River to the United States, therefore removing their claims to the area, therefore, from the perspective of white American citizens, opening that area up to Western expansion. At the same time, Native American confederations, and that's the name of the section that I'm looking at here, pages 334 to 337, tried to organize some way in which they could resist the settlement of white American citizens farther in the west, in the Ohio River Valley. And as we're going to see, Native Americans over time were unsuccessful in resisting white American expansion into the west, the Ohio River Valley. So it's a point worth emphasizing that the American Revolution, the aftermath of the American Revolution, unleashed a decades-long series of events which will follow moving forward in subsequent weeks, led to the increasing, first of all, violence between white American citizens and Native Americans, and ultimately the displacement of Native Americans by the early 1800s all the way west of the Mississippi River. And that's a subject that we'll get to in subsequent weeks. Now to get to the reason number 2 as to why the United States was a nation facing critical problems in the 1780s, that is financial reasons. And so part of what I'm going to talk about corresponds to pages 337 to 346 in 347, excuse me, in Alan Taylor's chapter called Shocks. But I'm going to just discuss briefly some of the financial reasons that Alan Taylor doesn't discuss in particular in this chapter. And I'm going to just discuss it briefly because, as we'll see next week with the reading, which begins on page 353, chapter 10 called Republics, these are going to be discussed in more detail, but I want to bring it up now just so that we have a little bit of a base of knowledge before we get into next week's reading and video lecture. And simply put, it is that the aftermath of the American Revolutionary War saw the nation, the United States, the national government, facing serious financial difficulties and more specifically debt. Now, what had occurred during the War for Independence itself in the years beginning in 1775 and in subsequent years was that both the Continental Congress, functioning as the temporary national government during the War for Independence, and the individual states, the 13 colonies which declared independence from the British Empire. What the Continental Congress and the individual states had done was to take out significant amounts of debt from two sources: from their own private citizens, so citizens of means, wealthy citizens, loaned the United States Continental Congress and individual states money in order to finance the war effort during the War for Independence, as well as European banking firms outside of England, of course, primarily in Holland and France, had loaned the United States significant amounts of money, as well as individual states, in order to finance war effort, to purchase arms and ammunition, to provide uniforms, to pay soldiers. So that beginning in 1782 and 1783, the both national government and the state governments faced a tremendous amount of debt and with very little means of paying it back in the short term. So this was a major issue facing the young United States. And just one further point that I want to make, and this will become relevant when we discuss next week the Constitution, is that regionally, the states in New England, so that's Massachusetts, in particular Massachusetts, but also Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, those states especially had taken out a tremendous amount of debt, more so than the states in the South, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and more so than the middle Atlantic states of New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. So that state debt, setting aside debt taken out by the Continental Congress, but individual state debt, was primarily concentrated farther to the north. This would become a major problem when we discuss the Constitutional Convention, and the creation of the Constitution. That's something we'll get to next week, so I'll just leave that there, but that's foreshadowing a future discussion that we'll have. So national and state debt was a major problem. That was compounded by the fact that the War for Independence, as all large wars do in human history, led to widespread destruction of property, especially and most importantly in the areas where it was fought, where the war itself was fought on a larger scale. And so that is New England, which, as we know, is the beginning regionally, the primary region in which the war was fought, beginning with the battles of Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, and in the middle Atlantic, New York and Pennsylvania primarily, which was where the war then shifted after 1776. Those two regions in particular, New England and New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, suffered through a tremendous amount of property damage. And in particular, that was damage to farms, family farms primarily, outside of urban areas like New York City and Philadelphia. And this damage was simply put because of the ravages of war as armies moved, both the American armies and the British Imperial Army moved operationally through the countryside outside of cities. Armies, when large numbers of soldiers move, they forage, they take food from farms, they destroy property to deprive their enemy of using that property, and in general, creating a devastated rural landscape. In the years after 1783, this caused significant problems because many soldiers who had fought in the American Revolution, especially in New England and in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, were demobilized and went home to find that their means of supporting themselves, primarily family farms, had been destroyed. So these two issues, debt and property destruction, but more specifically, agrarian farm destruction created an economic depression that struck the young United States just as it became an independent nation. A third reason for the a third reason why finances threatened to undermine the young United States was because of trade. During the American Revolution, normal transatlantic trade from North American ports like Boston, Philadelphia, New York, primarily, was suspended because of naval blockades by the British Army, or the British Navy, I should say. In the years immediately after the war, even after the formal end of the military conflict at Yorktown in October of 1781, while the British Empire began to demobilize its army, which is again where the Alan Taylor chapter 9 shocks begins, the British Navy continued to blockade United States ports. So trade was functionally suspended even after the war. I said transatlantic trade was functionally suspended even after the war itself was formally over. So the United States faced a three-pronged debt, agrarian property destruction, suspension of trade, a three-pronged economic threat that was, in the eyes of many historians, the most important reason why the 1780s was a period called, again, the critical period. And some of those financial difficulties are tied into the third reason that I spelled out at the very beginning of this chapter as to why the 1780s were a period called the critical period, which is governmental. And that is because the first government of the United States, so-called Articles of Confederation, was, and unbeknownst to many people living in the United States today, who believe that the Constitution was the first government of the United States. It was not. It was the Articles of Confederation. Unbeknownst to many people living today in the United States, the Articles of Confederation was, it became very clear, a spectacularly poorly designed government. So Alan Taylor talks just a little bit about the Articles of Confederation in a section called Articles, which begins on page 337, if I remember correctly. Yes, 337. But he doesn't quite give you a sense of what that governmental structure was like. So I want to take the rest of this video lecture to talk a little bit about the structure of the Articles of Confederation and point to some of the reasons why it was a failure, first of all, and second of all, point to the reason why the young United States during the critical period, but especially its political leaders, decided to create the Constitution, which will be the main theme of next week's class. And I just want to tell you now that some of the discussion I'm about to give you and some of the discussion I just provided about the economic hardships of the country is discussed a little bit in next week's chapter 10. So there's a little bit of overlap between the two, but just keep that in mind. But I want to talk just now a little bit about the Articles of Confederation. And simply put, the Articles of Confederation was a government framework which was created in 1777, so at the very beginning of the War for Independence, but which was not formally enacted until 1781, until the end of the war itself, at the Battle of Yorktown. The Articles of Confederation, the way to understand the Articles of Confederation only makes sense if you think of it as a reaction to the former colonies' relationship with the British Empire. The British Empire, which, as we know, many colonists were, by the 1760s and 1770s, significant critics of, had some advantages in that it was highly centralized. Power was centralized in the mother country in England, and it was a centralized imperial government which had a large bureaucracy in which the central government headquartered in London, in the mother country, reached its metaphorical tentacles to direct political and economic activity outside the mother country, and in particular in the North American and Caribbean colonies. So that another way of thinking about that is the British Empire was a centralized government which functioned only because power was so concentrated in the mother country that the imperial bureaucracy was capable of directing from a distance political, social, and economic activities in the periphery, which is P-E-R-I-P-H-E-R-Y, the periphery, which is the formal way of saying the colonies. The American Continental Congress, which created the Articles of Confederation, when it created the Articles of Confederation, was primarily concerned not to create a government which would mimic that of the British Empire, say a highly centralized government which could interfere with local conditions. And so they created the Articles of Confederation, which is in many ways the mirror image opposite of the British imperial structure. How? Well, first of all, the Articles of Confederation set up a governmental system based on a republic, a representative democracy, democracy for white men only, just to be clear, in which there was no branch that could mimic the authority centered in the king, as was the case in the British Empire, to the extent that the Articles of Confederation provided for no executive branch. So a simpler way to put that is there was no president of the United States under the Articles of Confederation. If you feared, like the Continental Congress did, that the Articles of Confederation could develop over time into something similar to the British Empire, with the figurehead and the centralized power and one person, a king, then you eliminate that possibility by not providing for an executive branch. Again, not providing for a president. If, as was the Continental Congress, you fear that the Articles of Confederation's legislative body, which was called the Confederation Congress, might become too similar to the British Parliament, which, as we know, going back to 1765, colonists in North America had long objected to the legislative power of Parliament over the colonies. If that is your fear, then you, meaning the Continental Congress, create an Articles of Confederation Congress, which has extremely limited powers. Most importantly, and most directly connected to the experience of protesting Parliament, the Articles of Confederation Congress was not given the power to tax the 13 states or the citizens of the 13 states of the young United States. So, for example, if you objected to Parliament's Stamp Act going back to 1765, and you wanted to create a government that could never pass something like a Stamp Act, then you deny the Congress under the Articles of Confederation from taxing at all. A major weakness, I should note, under the Articles of Confederation. We still today, I think, even though we live in the 21st century and the United States is much larger, much more complex, certainly technologically and financially complex, we tend to associate in many ways the government with many things, but primarily with taxation. Of course, the United States government, the national government, continues to tax us today. That fear was so real for the Continental Congress in 1777 when it created the Articles of Confederation that it prevented the Congress from levying taxes at all. This was a problem because it meant that the Articles of Confederation, the national government under the Articles of Confederation, could not raise revenues. We might not like being taxed, but tax money is levied, taxes are levied by governments in order to provide services, and that was impossible under the Articles of Confederation. If a government, as was the case in the Articles of Confederation, cannot tax, simply put, it cannot pay for anything. So that fact compounded the financial problems that I just discussed. The Articles of Confederation's Congress, secondarily, could not regulate trade of commodities and of people, if we're thinking about the sale of enslaved people within the United States, could not regulate trade from one state to another. So what this did in the years after 1783 was functionally create a paralyzed system of trade within North America. Each state came up with its own trade regulations, and there was no uniformity at all between the states. So what happened in practice is that citizens of the individual states functionally stopped trading with each other. And the Articles of Confederation Congress had no authority to provide any kind of uniform trade regulations. Why? Because one of the reasons why so many people in North America protested Parliament in particular was because they believed Parliament had too much regulatory power over trade. And so similar to the issue of taxation, let's prevent the Confederation Congress from in the future becoming a different version of Parliament by preventing it from regulating trade. Those two reasons, the inability to tax and the inability to regulate trade, ultimately would become, in my view, the downfall of the Articles of Confederation. And the primary reason why the Constitutional Convention, which created the American Constitution, was convened in the summer of 1787. And again, that's a subject that we'll get to next week. When we look at the Confederation Congress, one other point I want to make is that under the Articles, it was extremely difficult for Congress to pass any kind of law, even if it couldn't tax or regulate trade. Other areas of lawmaking authority were extremely difficult under the Articles of Confederation because it was determined that 9 of 13 states had to agree to a piece of legislation before it could be enacted into law. Unlike now in the United States Congress, when a simple majority is typically enough for a law to pass, under the Articles of Confederation, there needed to be a 72% majority, which made it extremely difficult to pass any kind of legislation. One area which Alan Taylor does discuss, beginning on page 340, and really the only area in which the Articles of Confederation had any kind of success, the Articles of Confederation's Congress, I should say, had any kind of success because there was widespread agreement across 13 states, was in organizing Western territories, these territories in the Ohio River Valley, which I discussed previously in particular, organizing the sale of land to promote the westward expansion of the United States citizens, which, as I mentioned earlier, would bring them into conflict with Native Americans. But in general, through the Northwest Ordinances, which are discussed on pages 340 and 341, the only success the Articles of Confederation Congress had was in creating procedures to organize and promote the sale of land to United States citizens in the West, as I said, primarily the Ohio River Valley, but also farther to the south in what is now the states of Kentucky and Tennessee. But in general, as I mentioned, the Articles of Confederation was provided for an extremely weak national government at a time when we see retrospectively what the United States needed during the so-called critical period was a strong national government that could impose especially financial authority over the young United States at a time of severe economic depression. I'm going to talk a little bit more next week again about the Constitution and a little bit more about class conflicts amongst American citizens within the United States, the young United States. These are subjects that are discussed in Chapter 10, a chapter called Republics. So I'm going to leave it there for today. Just wanted to give you a few ways of thinking about the so-called critical period, the first several years of the independent United States. And again, to wrap up this discussion, there were 3 primary reasons why the United States seemed destined to fail, not to succeed, but to fail in the years after 1783. Internal conflicts, some related to the removal, the demobilization, I should say, but the removal of white and people of African descent loyalists. Added to that, brewing conflicts with Native Americans in the West. Secondarily, reason number two, significant financial weaknesses in the 1780s. And third, the weaknesses of the United States' first governmental structure, the so-called Articles of Confederation. So I will leave it there for today. Just to finish this and to return to the very first things I said today. Your second primary source paper is due on Friday. You can find that under the Content tab on Blackboard. If you have any problems with either the paper or with uploading it to Blackboard, of course, feel free to email me, and I've heard from some of you. As I said as well, there is going to be no discussion response this week since you're working on your papers until the end of the week. And finally, as I said, on next Monday, April the 13th, I'm going to send to you the prompt for the final course essay. So I hope you all, to wrap this up, continue to be well and be in contact if you have any questions. And otherwise, I will see you through video next week. Okay, have a great weekend.